In Exeter, New Hampshire, inside this unassuming building, an international race is taking shape. Here at Phoenix Tailings, they're processing critical minerals, a key part of the global supply chain.
So Phoenix Tailings produces the final rare earth metal and metal alloys that are needed for magnets, for aerospace applications, and for many different other types of applications.
But companies like Phoenix Tailings, led by co-founder and CEO Nick Myers, are up against a giant.
There's been a lot of talk about critical minerals, rare earths and otherwise, and the disparity between China and the United States. How far behind is the United States right now?
That midstream processing stage, they pretty much dominate entirely. So much so that it's extremely tough for the U.S. to compete in any way, shape, or form.
The U.S. needs critical minerals for a range of military applications, but even more for many consumer products.
Defense is, functionally speaking, a pretty small market. It's roughly about 500 tons per year is the need for metal for the Defense Department. And that's not that much, whereas the U.S. commercial needs are about 12,000 tons per year. So pretty much all of our demand comes from automotive. Many people think that it's actually for electric vehicles. To be honest with you, not really. Like, yes, electric vehicles use much more rare earths than other vehicles. However, internal combustion motor vehicles quite heavily use rare earths.
China's dominance spans the entire supply chain, from extracting critical minerals to processing them and then turning them into magnets used in everything from cars to defense systems. It all raises the question, with that level of control, what can be done? And why wasn't more done sooner? David Abraham has spent years studying these issues, and they're the subject of his book, The Elements of Power.
We didn't focus on the challenges of the market. We saw that these minerals were a sector of the economy that was not interesting to us. We were focusing on building apps back in 2010 and 2011. It was how do we create a technological country that was built on services, was built on financial services, and mining was dirty. And so we outsourced this dirty work to faraway places. And China was realizing that these ingredients were providing them capital that they needed to grow their economy. But more importantly, they saw these as seeds to the future, seeds to their high-tech and green industries that are at the heart of their economy today.
As China quietly built its dominance, the first alarm bells for the U.S. came more than a decade ago.
American manufacturers need to have access to rare earth materials, which China supplies.
We realized that there was a structural risk back in about 2010, and that's when China and Japan had a territorial dispute, and within that, China had restricted access to rare earths to Japan. There was an initial shock, and the price of these materials, especially rare earths, jumped about 20 times. But what happened afterwards was that the prices themselves dropped. And they dropped to such low levels that people in the halls of power in Washington and in Europe, and some within Japan, became less concerned about security of supply. And so between about 2014 and about 2022, there wasn't much concern looking at these critical minerals because the market was supplying them.
Fast forward to today. Critical minerals are dominating the conversation, from the halls of Congress
The necessity of these minerals literally cannot be overstated.
to boardrooms
Look, for rare earth, we continue to diversify our supply chain.
and now to the center of President Trump's trade war with China.
My administration has taken extraordinary steps to make sure the United States has all of the critical minerals and rare earths that we need.
But ensuring the U.S. has what it needs may require a different approach. In a new report, Heidi Crebo-Rediker, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, says leapfrogging China is possible if the U.S. is strategic in its focus.
If the number one priority for the country were to somehow catch up on critical minerals and rare earths, how long would it take?
So through traditional mining, it actually takes a very long time. But the context that the report that we wrote at the Council on Foreign Relations was that, okay, so we have this traditional approach and we're going as fast as we can. It's going to take years, decades. It's going to take a very long time. And we have this timing mismatch. So we can't out-extract, out-process, or out-fund China, but we can actually have a separate track that looks to innovation. because there are a lot of great new companies and innovations rolling out that can actually leapfrog China's chokehold.
And that innovation has already begun to take shape across labs, startups, and in new technologies.
You have material engineering that has been able to create rare earth-free magnets up in Minnesota. You have new startups that came out of lab innovations that are able to manipulate proteins so that they act like protein robots and go into waste and extract rare earths from pools of waste. And waste is a very ripe area for the U.S. to be able to look to for our own capacity to generate our resilience.
It's almost like steel is the right way to go. It's the way to go.
One of those companies looking to extract critical minerals from mine waste, known as tailings, is Phoenix Tailings.
Take us through the Phoenix approach and why it's so much faster.
So Phoenix, we started this back in 2019. I met my co-founder at a Bible study, and we started talking about the biggest problems in the world. One is exactly this issue that we talk about here with critical minerals. So we said, let's find a way to solve it. And we built the first prototype with $7,000 back then in a backyard in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now we've raised $120 million, and we're backed by BMW, Sumitomo, and many other players. But our approach is to really use technology and develop the novel technology to be able to process and produce the final metals free of emissions, free of discharge, in a safe way right here in the United States. So we solve all three parts of the value chain, which is the extraction. That's what we think about when we think about normal mining. That's digging a hole in the ground and digging up the raw material. And we harvest that material from the ground. Now, once we have that mixture of rare earth oxides or carbonates, we have to separate that out. And that's the next stage of the process called separation. And you take that and you split it into the individual pieces. Now, they still remain in their oxide form, but they're split out. And that's generally what historically was the product that would send to China to be processed into the metal. And at Phoenix, what we do is we take that oxide and convert to metal. And that's one of our revolutionary key things that we do. We're one of the best in the world on how to take oxide and convert to metal. Stages a huge supply chain gap, and that's what we do primarily right here in New Hampshire. And this facility is designed as that one key part of that process.
The materials that you work with in your facility in New Hampshire, where are those mine tailings from?
So the facility in New Hampshire is buying actually normal mined products. We will vertically integrate to go upstream, meaning going closer to the mine site in the future. But right now it's normal mined products coming from the US and Australia.
Can you be competitive with the Chinese?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, honestly. Because fundamentally speaking, the Chinese control the market indices that dictate price, it's extremely challenging. Now, what I will say is that we are generally cost competitive with the Chinese operations. That's a very important thing to note. However, China does subsidize a lot of these operations, and the pricing does not quite indicate how an actual process will work. So it's always tricky to answer that question.
David Abraham says it's not enough just to be cost competitive with Chinese alternatives. You also need to have a complete supply chain that relies on the critical minerals you're producing.
My concern, as crazy as it sounds, is not for the materials themselves. It's to create supply lines so that we can make the products of the future. No one sells dysprosium or neodymium in the market. You can't just go to the store and buy it. They're critical to our phones, our robots, our vehicles, and that's where we need to be spending our time, is how are we creating the products that our next generation needs? How do we create the economy that our children want? And how do we ensure that defense systems that we're setting up to protect our countries are invulnerable to supply chain challenges? So you really want to start with the end, with the demand, and then use the inputs, these materials, and then focus on how to get them.
And in many ways, that is exactly what China has done, building not just the supply of these materials, but the industries that depend on them.
China, for many of these materials, is the market. They produce, depending on the material, 70, 80, 90% of a particular material, but they also consume 60, 70, 80, 90% of the material. Their supply lines are becoming increasingly tight. I was back in China in 2011, and they were quite clear. The materials that they were producing in their country are set to be consumed in their country. They did not see a benefit to export.
China built its playbook around critical minerals long before the US, and it's used its entire system of government to execute on its plan. Something that former US Ambassador to China, Nick Burns, says we need to take into account.
How does our system compete on something like critical minerals, given where we are? Because it may take a long time for our system to come around to the right decision. In the meantime, China's off to the races.
So when I was educated a long time ago, college and graduate school, I prayed at the altar of free trade, and I became a free trader in my youth, and like most people in Washington, as an official, a young official, 80s, 90s, even into this century, free trade was our gospel. I now think, to directly answer your question, it's a really important question, both President Biden and President Trump have now engaged in a degree of industrial policy, recognizing if you're up against this authoritarian, colossal economic power, and that's what China is, we have to isolate certain industries, pick out certain industries in the United States for special support. The United States government needs to pick out our national champions in rare earths, there are very few of them, and support them financially. And President Trump's gone all the way to take a financial stake for the USG in this. And frankly, I don't think we compete with China in certain industries without that degree of involvement by the U.S. Executive branch that we really haven't seen in a way since FDR's time, when we had to have a war production economy in the 1940s during the Second World War.
When it comes to critical minerals, the U.S. has to recognize that it's playing from behind. It has to get its playbook right, and it needs to see how much the Chinese government is doing to promote its industry. But with all that, Ambassador Burns still believes the U.S. can get back in the game.
I will say this, President Xi Jinping has basically become a one-man show. So there is an advantage, in a way, that Xi Jinping can order things to be done and have them implemented. But you know, if you compare our system to theirs, I'll take our system every day. Our democracy is messy. There's too much partisanship in Washington. But what's not a problem is that we believe in democracy and human rights and the rule of law and the balance of power among three branches of the U.S. government. I'll take that any day over China's system.